Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. Estamos haciendo un vestido para tierra caliente, un vestido de verano. Es nuestro primer proyecto que nos mandan a hacer. Sí, es un primer encargo de tejido que una compañera de trabajo pues me mandó a hacer, me dio la plata para comprar los materiales y todo lo demás. Entonces lo que vamos a hacer, este es el progreso de este vestido que estamos haciendo. Les voy a mostrar. Entonces, bueno, la idea es que esto va a ser un vestido de verano, un vestido para tierra caliente. Y pues nada, pues me alegra mucho porque es la primera vez que me hacen un encargo de estos. Pues la gente ve mis talentos con el tejido. Entonces, pues bueno, vamos a transmitir un poco mientras vamos tejiendo y vamos escuchando el podcast del señor James Lindsay, que nos habla sobre un montón de cosas muy importantes del mundo. ¿Ya? No.
Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, outlines a global to-do list for averting ecological and societal breakdown within a vanishing time frame. In other words, we're now under a huge time pressure, so we've got to do all this stuff in order to save the world. In other words, hi, we're from the Club of Rome, and we're the Antichrist. That's what the Antichrist does. The Antichrist says, look, the apocalypse is here, I'll save you from it, and lures people to their own destruction. Based on advanced computer modeling of system dynamics, just like they had during COVID-19, y'all, the visionary report lays out 5 extraordinary turnarounds in socioeconomic organization necessary to avoid collapse and create an equitable world within planetary limits. So within planetary limits means the communist goal of a circular managed economy, which means there's a tyrannical power that controls the entire marketplace or the entire economy. So now you have a planned and managed economy. We know where that's going to go. To create an equitable world, which means equity means socialism, it means redistribution. And this is going to require 5 extraordinary turnarounds in what? In socioeconomic organization. In other words, the current, what did Chrystia Freeland call it? She called it capitalist democracy. The current system has to see 5 extraordinary turnarounds in socioeconomic organization in order to avoid the collapse that their computer models predict very conveniently for them. Never mind that this is like the 5th time they've put something out and all the other models have been wrong. Never mind that they don't understand that when things become scarce, like let's say we actually started to run out of copper, they become very expensive. And when they become very expensive, there's a huge pressure for innovation when that is allowed to occur because you're not in a totalitarian system. And you reward people who come up with the innovations. You reward people who find a workaround. Oh no, copper's become very scarce. Let's imagine. Copper's now very expensive. There is a massive incentive structure built into that circumstance in a market to figure out something that can replace copper. And whoever figures it out is going to become a fucking billionaire, which is a gigantic incentive structure. So guess what? These problems that they say, oh my God, we're going to run out of this. Oh my God, we're going to run out of that. Oh my God. These are actually the impeti, the mothers of innovation and invention. They are not problems of destruction like these doomsayers, these doom pillars who want to steal all of the power using your fears. They're not the engines of disaster that they portray. They are engines of innovation. And these innovations unlock new levels of actual sustainability for human populations and standards of living because they represent, when you find them, massive increases in efficiency, massive increases in capacity to deliver the same goods and services with less energy and input. Earth for All, on the other hand, they say, outlines ambitious levers for system change in policy areas of poverty, inequality, empowerment of women, energy, and food. So they're not going to solve poverty. That's bullshit. They don't have the slightest idea what causes poverty. It's not systems. They're not going to solve inequality for the same reason. Their empowerment of women, could we get more tired of something? Like we've been doing that for 50 fucking years. It's not working. The empowerment of women, like really? That's not how you empower women. You empower women by creating a safe, stable structure around them that allows their femininity to flourish. This isn't complicated. And then they're going to intervene in energy and food. Guess what? That's called energy and food scarcity, with which they're going to control populations. But like I said, this is a lot like China. This is a lot like China under Mao. So we're looking at energy and food as kind of like steel and grain and the so-called Great Leap Forward. But in this case, in the West, we're not aiming to Great Leap Forward. We're not aiming to have gigantic production. Mao's goal was to take China and get it ahead of the United Kingdom in production in under 15 years, ideally 3, which turned out to destroy his country. Well, as it turns out, the goal here isn't to do that. Our goal is actually in the West to lower our energy consumption and standard of living to somewhere around the third world in order to prove how great and sustainable and inclusive we are. But here, I digress. Let me read from them some more. The report advises that, quote, only when we pull these bold levers early and strongly will we see accelerated transformation, which means rushing into communism, toward a sufficiently fair, just, and safe world. Fair, just, and safe world, when written by communists, means communism. Get it in your head. When they say this shit, they don't mean normal stuff. They mean communism. Everything good that they say means communism. Everything bad that they say means enemy of communism. It's that simple. So those are the levers, though. Poverty, inequality, these are the manipulation points. Empowerment of women, energy, and food. They say these levers themselves receive detailed treatment, which I'm not going to cover. However, a more elusive factor in this important equation concerns the we, who must pull them. Oh, who's going to control all this? Who's going to pull these levers of destruction on your society? Well, I bet you it's going to be the converged, Chrystia Freeland, I bet you it's going to be the converged nonprofit, public, and private sectors who are all coordinating in a gigantic cartel that's almost certainly a racketeering scam being used to defraud and destroy and loot the treasuries of our countries. So the paper seeks to catalyze Earth for All's call to action by asking, who are we? So they want to know, who are we? Oh, it's not going to be us, the stakeholders, the Soviets, the party. It's going to be us, we, everybody. We are Canadians, for example. What qualities limit us? What strengths do we possess? You see, now it's everybody, but it's not. They're the ones pulling the levers, but they're going to try to get people to do it from underneath. When they motivate the public to have a belief and make a huge demand and then push a propaganda campaign to do that, to make the public demand their change that they want to implement, that's called a mass line. That is what the Chinese communists perfected, was the mass line, to make everybody believe the masses demand it. The leaders are not to be held responsible. The masses demanded these changes. So we're going to ask ourselves, what qualities limit us? What strengths do we possess? In what ways are our human frailties fundamental in our failing systems? In other words, in what ways is it our fault? Notice that they just assume our systems are failing. They don't actually prove our systems are failing. They're just breaking them and then saying the systems are failing. And here's the kicker, right? Here's the punchline. And who must we become to exercise collective agency at the necessary unprecedented scale? Okay, let's talk about this. Exercising collective agency means communism. Who must we become to exercise collective agency at the necessary unprecedented scale, like when Mao mobilized the 600 million peasants of China? Their own mass death. 1 out of 6 of them maybe died as a result of his programs. Who must we become? You must become the new Soviet man, or the new man, or the sustainable inclusive man, or a global citizen. You have to transform yourself on a spiritual and values-based level. That's what's going on underneath all this. This is what the party is trying to foist on you, Canada. And the NDP is worse. What they are trying to foist upon you is a fundamental change in your religious disposition to believe their crackpot world religion that just so happens to get you mired down in this guilt and shame and confused level of spiritual transformation while they happen to pull all the levers of power. And now you are going to share your freaking bedrooms with people in housing reform. It says the material aspects of the global crises we face are well understood. No, they're not. That's all lies. Energy systems, dangerous emissions, biosphere destruction, income, agriculture, food security. Less well understood is why. Despite having the policy instruments, the technologies, and the resources available to address them, we still aren't doing so at anywhere near an appropriate rate. So to fill this stark gap in our understanding requires a perspective on system change, communism. that reaches beyond, like religious, like transcendent, or rather within external structures and strategies. Remember when Herbert Marcuse said that the ideal society is contained within the present society, but we need to criticize away those elements we don't like? So maybe it's that the perspective on system change exists within external structures and strategies to the human mind that built and maintained them. Oh, so we have to change who we are. As such, this deep dive paper calls urgently for attention to the underexplored inner dimension of system change. In other words, the Club of Rome, because it hasn't been able to achieve its goals yet with its partners in the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, clearly the Canadian government, we're going to hear the Liberal Party in particular, all of that, they still haven't been able to force the world to buy their garbage. And so now they're going to focus on the inner dimension. They're going to try to awaken a sustainable and inclusive spirituality for you as a new religion. So defining the inner dimension, it says in a little box, no verbal definition of the inner world could possibly be complete. Oh, you'll know it when you see it, because they're Gnostic wizards. Arguably, the more precise, the less accurate we would be in naming the boundless, multifaceted arena of human thought and experience, and we mean purposefully to avoid limiting the reader in their conception of it. So it's all in the imagination. In fact, that's all throughout this, which guess what? That's exactly what communism is about. You can imagine a communist world, so obviously we can work to build one, and people can just be remade in order to achieve it. Generally, however, when we say inner, we mean the domain of cognition, emotion, consciousness, and culture, a complex interplay between individual, subjective experience, unconscious processes, and neurophysiology, interpersonal relationships, collective beliefs, and social constructs. It is contrasted by the material outer world of landscapes and objects, but neither realm is truly separate or distinct. This straight Marxist ontology at this point, and both exist in dynamic interdependence, continuously influencing and informing one another. A little bit more from the introduction. I think I'll probably get through most of it and skim a little bit of the document for you. That inner conditions have played a central role in creating and maintaining our current crises seems in one sense too obvious to mention, and yet this fact is too often absent from high-level solutions analysis. Let me reread that in the original Communist. That bourgeois values have played a central role in creating and maintaining our current crisis, and socialism seems in one sense to be too obvious to mention. Yet the fact is too often absent from high-level solutions analysis. That's exactly what they're actually saying. People have the wrong values. They have bourgeois values, as the Marxists would put it, and those bourgeois values have to be transformed through inner work. Inner work, as Mao called it, ideological remolding, or sometimes translated as thought reform, or just brainwashing. The shifting values and evolutionary impulses, so this ties into all the weird UN stuff I've been telling you. They've been trying to control the evolution of man and the planet. The shifting values and evolutionary impulses underpinning escalating consumerism, the rise of individualism and fragmentation of collective identity, the biases and emotions that drive our political behavior, there's so many not sentences in this, it's amazing. All are forever present and active, pulling the levers of our outer world. And as vested interests are more than aware, they are susceptible to influence. As a matter of course, we allow commercial and political forces to manipulate the human inner world in ways directly contributing to our polycrisis. So there's your standard World Economic Forum buzzword. The great narrative for the better future, as Klaus Schwab put it, was that we have the polycrisis, which is all these existential crises all at once, including black swans. P.S. It's not a black swan if it's a white swan that they painted black in an intelligence lab, but at any rate, in other words, they manufactured a black swan rare event. It's changing. They manufactured it. It wasn't a black swan. It was a fucking false flag. But anyway, polycrisis is the great narrative for the better future is that the polycrisis is the reason why we need greater global coordination through the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, and by proxy, their real master, the CCP. But as wisdom traditions and science unequivocally show, because in their religion, by the way, all religions, philosophies, science, and so on are actually just pieces of the same story, and they happen to know more of the whole story, and they're going to therefore guide spiritual evolution of people. But as wisdom traditions and science unequivocally show, we are also capable of understanding, nurturing, transforming and maturing our views, qualities, and capacities in ways that support the flourishing of the whole. In other words, what they're saying is we can become more collectivist. We just have to be willing to do the inner transformational work. This is absolutely communist garbage. The inner, then, is not simply an elective complement to systems change approaches, but an inseparable, primordial, and unavoidable aspect of human-made systems themselves. It is written through every external structure and interaction, and as such, the language of Donella Meadows, the co-author of The Limits to Growth, represents a deep leverage point for change. In other words, they can use people's values by transforming them to transform the world in the direction of their collectivist totalitarian nightmare that will kill billions of people. Canada, this is you. Indeed, while consideration of the inner has become lost amid more structural concerns in recent decades, it was integral to the founding vision of the Club of Rome. In The Human Quality, founder Aurelio Pecci, we're going to hear more about him soon, emphasize that inner change is foundational to necessary structural transformation. Are you getting the picture yet? This is a religion. They're a religion of communism, and they're trying to force people to transform themselves in line with it. Earth for All's analysis and recommendations do touch on aspects of the inner. For example, social trust is emphasized, albeit as a mediator between external factors such as financial equality and political effectiveness. Now, where have I heard that phrasing before? That we need social trust that is mediating between external factors like financial equality and political effectiveness. Well, financial equality, by the way, socialism, and political effectiveness is their ability to take things over. But actually, that is actually the given justification in the document held at Stanford, the translated document from 2014, where the Chinese government explains why they want to build a social credit system. That's actually right there the purpose, because you will increase social trust by identifying who the bad elements are, whether they're financially irresponsible in one way or another. Maybe they don't pay their bills, or maybe they hoard money or grain or whatever to themselves, or they're political dissidents, which causes fracturing and it causes division. So social trust as mediated through financial and political structures or factors is the word I'm looking for, is actually the given justification by the Chinese Communist Party for why they wanted to build a social credit system in the first place. And what is the social credit system supposed to measure if it were in its most advanced state? How healthy the community and the individuals in it are, in the sense of this broad understanding of well-being. So what's the next word in this document? Well-being, while treated as an end in itself, is largely reduced to a function of external variables such as disposable income and government services per capita. Okay, first of all, no, the fuck it's not. Government services per capita is not a measurement of well-being. That's a measurement of your government taking your money and setting it on fire instead of letting you do something that would increase your well-being. Your well-being is overwhelmingly connected to your standard of living, which is overwhelmingly what they're trying to destroy and lower on purpose. So don't let these people lie to you with all of this garbage. Left unexplored, they say, are myriad other dependencies of structural dynamics upon hearts and minds. Likewise, the important ways in which inner conditions can meaningfully be addressed directly. This absence reflects a blind spot in wider cultures of sense-making. Understandable at the time the report was published, yet just 2 years on, pioneering initiatives have begun a significant shift. Consideration of the inner dimensions of systems is entering the mainstream. In other words, they're running a huge propaganda program on it. Here, we aim to equip the reader with a very basic introduction to this critical, neglected dimension of the system's landscape, or in other words, of communist programming. Readers may be familiar with some or all concepts. Our intention is less to break new ground than to provide language and synthesis that can enable more confident discussion and inclusion of the inner in systems and complexity thinking and transformative approaches. All of that you just heard, systems and complexity thinking and transformative approaches, are just standard communist lies yet again. Everything's so systematic and complex, and only we really understand how it all works, and we only understand how to change it so that it works better, so therefore give us all the power. And what they're talking about here is creating a religious transformation in people. Here's how they summarize the document, and then I'll kind of skim a little bit to give you a flavor of it, and then we're going to go back to Pierre Trudeau to talk about the Liberal Party of Canada. Section 1 provides some historical context. How have we reached a situation where the interdimensions of systems is so widely deprioritized in public discourse? Section 2 introduces some elements of the essential inner and their importance to sustainable transformation. 2.1 considers the profound changes in systems of thought and relationship with the world that are possible over the medium to long term. 2.2 considers certain inner states, traits, and capacities foundational to those changes and to societal well-being, which individuals and groups can be empowered to transform through evidence-based practices, like social emotional learning, for sure. Section 3 goes on to introduce existing applications that are putting these insights into practice in the service of system transformation and sustainability, that is, communism. We won't claim that inner factors alone are enough to summon the necessary turnarounds, like demons, but we will insist that the external levers will never be sufficient either. The physical and psychological dimensions of systems are fundamentally inseparable. In other words, subjective and objective are actually in a dialectical relationship, for those of you who are keeping up with their actual ontology. And effective approaches must integrate both. In her own deep dive paper, Ramphel, that's not a real fucking name. Mamphela, M-A-M-P-H-E-L-A, Ramphela, R-A-M-P-H-E-L-E, that's not a real name. Honorary president of the Club of Rome, noticed that, quote, living systems change requires holistic rather than fragmented approaches. It's still the same Hegelian Marxist trash. In the coming pages, we offer ways of including the inner that can support more holistic views, models, and interventions, affording the psycho-social, spiritual conditions for collective action, due consideration in the complex picture of systems change. Humanity's future well-being depends on restoring agency in this neglected inner domain. So what they're literally saying is that their religion is necessary to save the world. So what is this? Let's just skim a little bit of this, so then we'll go to Pierre Trudeau. I know it's going to be a lot, but 1, historical context. What's the first thing they say? Beyond the Enlightenment way of looking. So this is an anti-Enlightenment move. So basically everything since the Enlightenment that has enabled the massive rise of standard of living, the massive destruction of poverty or reduction of poverty, the massive reduction of basically every huge societal ill that you can imagine that is simply tameable. All of that, we need to now look beyond that. We need to think past that. It's time to go, they'll say transcend into the Enlightenment, but what they actually mean is to an anti-Enlightenment perspective. And they say, in expanding perspectives on system change beyond the external world, it is helpful to understand the forces that led dominant cultures to deprioritize and oversimplify the inner forces that were themselves an inner phenomenon and which shaped the complex crises we face today. The Enlightenment worldview, rooted in the embrace of empiricism, that's evidence, reductionism, and rationalism, which means the elevation of reason to tame and control the passions, the emotions, allowed its 18th century European proponents to comprehend and manipulate the material world with remarkable success, undeniably propelling human progress. Consequently, from vaccines and antibiotics to hot showers and holidays, the average person in high-income countries now enjoys standards of living that even royalty of bygone eras could not have imagined. However, the most powerful ideas of that time have also given rise to the existential threats we now grapple with. While this worldview is far from universal, it is no coincidence that it is foundational in those cultures of modernity that bear the most responsibility for our current, it doesn't say manufactured, but manufactured crises. And then it goes on to talk about all of the problems of the Enlightenment. And as a matter of fact, if you were reading this, you would think that you're reading one of these far-right doomer reactionaries talking about reductionism, separation, disconnection, and the need for interconnection to heal us, materialism being a problem, rationalism being a problem, on and on and on. And then it contrasts this with the elements of the essential inner. And it says, here we offer a rudimentary outline of inner-outer dynamics. Read that as the subjective-objective dialectic if you're paying attention to what's really going on. Crucial to sustainable transformation, which means using Marxist dialectical techniques to transform your values so that you will be a Marxist. In other words, becoming a new Marxist man in the 21st century mold, which is sustainable and inclusive. Plus, wishing to accelerate the transformation, just like Mao's Great Leap Forward into the dust. Section 2.1 introduces certain abstract systems meaning, mental models with conceptual content, blah, 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 blah. But they're really clear that this is about subjective states, psychological traits, transformative capacities, such that in big, bold letters, any serious effort to confront the pressing issues we face as a species must, as the maxim goes, get beyond the kind of thinking that created them. In other words, you have to have a evolutionary or quantum leap in human spiritual status. And the point is that the inner dimensions of the system are in every way as complex as the outer, which is a daunting thought perhaps until we consider the extent of humanity's collective power to intervene in this territory. In other words, you can create massive social pressure to change people's values. So then they go on, systems of meaning and mindsets, worldviews and paradigms. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. That's quoting Albert Einstein to make himself look smart and full. But you know what this is all about. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's all about how we're going to use social paradigms to transform people's values. And in fact, the next section is called Values, 2.1.2, Values. You're quoting Mahatma Gandhi, your values become your destiny. So here they're very clear that they're going to start talking about intrinsic and extrinsic values and this idea of transforming your values towards sustainability and inclusion. This is a religion. This is the Club of Rome. I want you to keep that in mind because I'm about to go back to Pierre Trudeau and explain to you how Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada for 50 years have been subscribed to this religious transformation of Canada in line with becoming Marxist new men. The next section is called Individual and Collective Identity. We belong to each other, it says, quoting Thich Nhat Hanh, their favorite poet. We cannot cut reality into pieces. Every side is our side. No, the communists are most fucking definitely not on our side. They are a destructive parasite that needs to be held out of power everywhere in the world for the rest of time. They are not on our side. Every side is not our side. There are people who want to destroy our way of life, who want to control other people, and there are people who are fundamentally operating a parasitic ideology that drains institutions and countries of their resources to the mass death of their citizens or collapse of their institutions. Implicit, they say, in the operation of values, identity is another key aspect of mindset, a collection of perceptions and stories about what it means to be me or us. Blah, 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 collective behavior. Historically, for example, in a period when China identified with an interdependent, harmonic web of life and deployed its immense navy with restraint, the European imperative to dominate and exploit the world was strongly influenced by a biblical notion of human power over a hostile natural world, resurgent in Enlightenment thought. So here they go with all of this. Circle of empathy, the deeper story of humanity, African Ubuntu, for fuck's sake, indigenous wisdoms, self-expanding emotions. This is religious gobbledygook. And then the next section, appropriately, is religion, spiritual sensibility, and existential inquiry. Quoting from the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change. Sorry, I'm laughing. If we each offer the best of our
the Islamic Declaration on Global Warming. What?
Remains a primary unifying force in collective identities across the world. Despite the rise of secular individualism, 85% of people globally still identify with a religion. That is what Rick Warren said in 2008. Threatening them that 5 out of 6 people on the planet are religious, and that the World Economic Forum better figure out the values dimension and the religious dimension and basically give him a cut into it, or else they're never going to get their transformation. It's not going to be enough to have a public and private partnership. You're going to have a public-private spiritual partnership, which will be the third leg of the stool. In other words, you're going to have to infiltrate the religions and transform people's values, and that's been a World Economic Forum effort. Self-transcendent, planetary stewardship. I'm just reading the bold words: existential questions, spiritual sensibility. this is what I'm saying. What does it say here? To achieve the extraordinary turnarounds will depend on a measure of soul searching across society, and a sense of the sacred, whatever shape it takes, is profoundly relevant to sustainability challenges. Global crises raise existential questions, individual and collective. They can't leave that one out. They always have to make an excuse to talk about collectivism. Why do we exist? What's my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? What are my responsibilities toward the collective? Jesus. Religious frameworks and spiritual inquiry tend to support people in exploring such questions in secular contexts. There is a growing need to develop a similar capacity. Okay, so now listen. I know this is primarily for Canada, but let me tell you about the United States. In the United States, we have our First Amendment. Our First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, which is not exactly how it's worded. As a matter of fact, there are two clauses representing religion. One is called the Establishment Clause, which is it. Congress will not make law regarding the establishment of religion. The other is called the Free Exercise Clause, which continues that sentence and says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay, so we have the Free Exercise Clause. In other words, the government can't interfere with your practice of religion. In other words, they can't actually pressure your churches to change their values in line with the sustainable bullshit. And then there's the Establishment Clause, that the government itself cannot establish religion. Now, I realize that you don't have that in Canada, but that's not why I'm bringing this up. I just want you to understand what we're seeing here. So for centuries, there have been fights, 2.5 centuries now, there have been fights over what that means. Every constitutional provision has been battled out in the courts throughout all of American history. And in the late 1980s, a guy named Ben Clements, if it's maybe late 1990s, I think it's late 1980s, 89 if I'm not wrong, did a law review of all of the First Amendment jurisprudence about the Establishment Clause to try to narrow down how on earth should we define religion for First Amendment jurisprudence. And what he said is that it has to be a comprehensive system of belief and practice. That's quality number one. That gives fundamental answers to questions about the world and man's role in it. That's number two. Such that it inspires duties of conscience. That's characteristic number three. Global crises raise existential questions. Let's read that paragraph again. Individual and collective. Why do we exist? What's my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? What are my responsibilities toward the collective? Those are fundamentally religious questions. Here we have the Club of Rome trying to organize a comprehensive system of belief and practice based on sustainability and inclusion and global transformation into communism. And they have said that at the center of this is an inner growth dimension that is based off of fundamental questions about the world and what it means to live in it. Why do we exist? What's my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? Those are religious questions, such that three, it gives rise to duties of conscience, which are things you're required to act upon in keeping with the morality of your religion. What are my responsibilities toward the collective? So this is a collectivist religion, according to First Amendment jurisprudence in the United States, absolutely clearly. I could go on and on about this. It's really horrifying. Interstates, traits, and capacities, they break it all down. Liberating attention, reclaiming agency, overcoming bias to see clearly. These are the section titles. Developing sense-making, grasping complexity. That means learning to see things through their Marxist lens. Activating imagination, like I told you, unleashing possibility. Promoting resilience. That's one of their magic words, guys. If you see that, you're dealing with communists. Mitigating threat response. They're talking about psychological resilience, ecological resilience, trauma of fucking course. Cultivating the heart, embodying connection. This is religion. And then its applications and action. I'm not going to talk about that in particular. I just wanted to give you a taste of this document. This is where the Club of Rome sits today. Okay, I'm just going to read this one last little bit for you from the conclusion. Conclusion. Earth for All acknowledges that in capital letters, giant leap toward an equitable ecological system willing to reshape markets and drive long term for societies, end quote. A giant leap, really? A great leap, maybe? A great leap forward, just like the Chinese, except again, this is a great leap backwards. We're not leaping forward into production, which is what the Chinese attempted to do. We're leaping backwards out of production and into bullshit called sustainable and inclusion. It says, it goes on, he says it again, needless to say, if this were our current state of governments, capably oriented toward global cooperation, communism, in the long term, planetary interest, communist control, not to mention energized by an ambitious public mandate, mass line, this is all communism, this is all Maoism, then something like the giant leap scenario would be in progress already. They're literally calling it a giant leap. Great Reset wasn't good enough for you. Great Leap Forward, giant leap into sustainable, equitable, ecological global systems. This is, every alarm bell you have should be ringing. This is them. This is the Club of Rome. The last paragraph says, knowing only that our world will change beyond recognition, we have an opportunity to consider what foundations we would wish to build change upon. So change is inevitable. There's nothing you can do to stop it. We just have to get in the right direction, and you'll be rewarded if you do, and you'll be punished if you don't. Straight Maoist compliance tactics, permitting ourselves at this late hour to imagine a giant leap in socioeconomic transformation. Hello, Mao Zedong. We must likewise imagine the great shift in inner conditions that would allow it. In other words, if we want to have a great leap forward, everybody's going to have to ideologically remold themselves to have the values that advance socialism or sustainability or inclusion. This is Mao exactly. Okay, so that's also the Club of Rome. This is Mao exactly. This is Maoism precisely. Couldn't be more clear, and it's the Club of Rome. Now, we were talking about Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada and its relationship to the Club of Rome going all the way back. In the 1970s, I would try to be dramatic and mess that up. The 1970s were a tumultuous time in Canadian federal politics. This is what Christopher Orr is telling us in that paper from the University of Toronto Press. Following Trudeau mania in 1968, politics remained energized by the figure of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. While the economy, energy, and national unity were dominant concerns, the economy was troubled by persistent stagflation and then the imposition of wage and price controls and an increasing deficit. Energy policy was punctuated by two organizations of the petroleum exporting countries, that is OPEC, crises, the creation of Petro-Canada, the nationalist policy of the Foreign Investment Review Agency, and the polarizing influence of the 1980 National Energy Program. National unity raised its head during the 1970 October crisis through Western alienation, with the 1976 election of the Parti Québécois under René Lévesque. I'm sorry, French people. I apologize. I tried. And the Quebec referendum in 1980. These are issues that have captivated Canadians. This was also the era in which Canadian environmental governance formally emerged. I should really do that whole sentence again just so you can hear it correctly. This was also the era in which Canadian environmental governance formally emerged during Trudeau mania, which would be when Pierre Trudeau and his Liberal Party took control of the government in 1968, which was a kind of high tide for cultural Marxism, or critical Marxism more specifically. Environmental governance is the way a society collectively directs itself. Listen to how often you're hearing the same words. Collectively directs itself in relation to the environment, and this refers to the visions, decisions, policies, institutions, laws, and actions by which a society holistically directs itself. Are you noticing that this is the same language from the cult we just heard from? According to this definition, leaders and governments do not hold ultimate power or make decisions in isolation. Many other factors influence how society collectively governs itself. As such, although there are many precursors to Canadian environmental governance, academics present Trudeau's tenure during the 1970s as the formal beginning of Canadian environmental governance. So we can think Trudeau Sr., sort of. We know what we're talking about here, right? Everybody knows that Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau are probably not related. Like, everybody kind of knows that, right? Anyway, we can blame Pierre Trudeau in the 1970s for beginning this Canadian environmental governance. And I would say that's tied to the Club of Rome, except you would need evidence for that. But that's actually the whole point of this freaking paper, is that it was all based off of his relationship with the Club of Rome, which we just heard about, which is unambiguously a religious death cult based on communist ideas about sustainability and inclusion and governance. It says, indeed, the Department of the Environment, DOE, was created in 1971. That would be under Pierre Trudeau's government, and more environmental laws were passed in the 1970s than in the previous 100 years. Throughout Trudeau's tenure, historians have documented the development of specific issues in Canadian environmental politics, such as Great Lakes pollution, renewable energy, and automotive pollution. However, much less is known about Trudeau's role in shaping Canadian environmental governance in the 1970s. Trudeau's environmental ambition is presented as fleeting, waning after the environmental enthusiasm of the 1960s faded. Three people whose names don't matter, Dorn, Ald, and Stoney, argue that the Trudeau regime, quote, did not systematically attend to environmental policy and governance, end quote. They claim that under Trudeau, the 1970s had promising environmental beginnings, but the effectiveness of environmental policy experienced a long decline. Thus, environmental ideas and policies in the 1970s are often treated as nascent, with little to be explained. These claims are troubling, given that as Canada is a parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister and Cabinet have power over the budget and are at the center of environmental policy making and law. So the argument here is that Trudeau had great environmental aspirations, Trudeau mania kicked off, and that he didn't actually get very much done, and the reason are some of these external factors that actually hampered Liberal Party power. It says little is known about Trudeau's environmental views, their extent, and how they fit into his thinking. His ideas were complex, ranging from idealistic to pragmatic. They evolved through his tenure. Nowhere in there does it say empirical or rational. It says idealistic and pragmatic. If it works, I guess. They evolved through his tenure and often did not fit standard labels such as liberal, progressive, or nationalist. Much attention has been paid to Trudeau's positions on national unity, the economy, and energy, which dominated the 1970s, while others have focused on his approach to foreign policy, his political appeal, or repatriation of the Constitution. These works pay scant attention to the environment and have overwhelmingly concluded that the environment was not a priority for Trudeau. However, there is tantalizing evidence to the contrary. So this guy is digging up the fact that the broad consensus so far has been that Trudeau's government in the 60s and 70s didn't particularly, through 82, I guess, didn't particularly give a crap about the environment, which is the prevailing view. But lo and behold, there's evidence to the contrary. In fact, he was very interested in the environment. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that he did an awful lot to restructure, not just the creation of the Department of the Environment, but to restructure Canadian politics and Liberal Party priorities in line with the views of the Club of Rome. So here's what it says. However, there is tantalizing evidence to the contrary. Although he was a prolific writer, Trudeau wrote nothing during his 20 years in politics. Even so, some of his earliest and latest writings suggest that the environment was important to him. Studies that have looked closely at Canadian environmental politics in the 1970s suggest a surprising depth of thinking and strength of initiatives, not only during Trudeau's first term, 1968 through 72, but also enduring throughout the decade. For instance, Trudeau met with the Club of Rome at least 3 times before the Department of Environment was created in 1971. For instance, Pierre Trudeau, met with the Club of Rome, which we just heard is a communist death cult, at least 3 times before the Department of Environment was created in 1971, and the Trudeau administration initially attempted to implement a systems approach with the Department of Environment. But that's exactly what we just heard. We need new values in order to be able to get to. It was a systems approach. But that's what the Trudeau administration and the Liberal Party around him were attempting to bring into the Department of Environment in Canada in the early 1970s, over 50 years ago. Trudeau was actively involved in these early debates about the DOE's mandate. Shortly thereafter, the Science Council of Canada developed the idea of the Conserver Society. The result in 1978 was the largest federal investment in renewable energy to date. First-hand accounts from this period also indicate that the Trudeau administration held environmental views that deeply challenged the status quo. Former Liberal Minister of Environment John Roberts viewed the Mulroney's government, the Mulroney government's adoption of sustainable development as a setback and dilution of environmental ambition when compared to the Trudeau years. So adopting sustainable development was a setback as compared to the aggressive environmental systems, aka communist control mechanisms of Trudeau in the 60s and his early 70s actually, and his meetings with the Club of Rome and the priorities of his Liberal Party that were aligned as such. So it asks the question, were Trudeau's early environmental ambitions as fleeting as some have suggested, or more persistent and profound than has been recognized? How can we reconcile Trudeau's early transformative, there's the word again, perspective and ambition on the environment with what is often seen as the disappointing and relatively anti-ecological outcome of the 1970s? And why did the Trudeau government fail to live up to its own environmental rhetoric? This article draws on diverse sources to illuminate environmental and economic ideas, policies, actions in Canadian federal politics, 1968 to 1982. This evidence reveals a novel account of Canadian environmental politics, demonstrating two seemingly contradictory things. On the one hand, Trudeau's environmental aspirations in the 1970s were much more ambitious, integrative, and far-reaching than previously thought. He persistently voiced and initially supported a transformative, communist, environmental agenda that included a systems approach, communist, which he got from the Club of Rome, rejection of economic growth in favor of an alternative view of prosperity. Holy shit. That's the exact same sentence from the other thing. And a shift in societal values from consumerism and greed towards efficiency and well-being, the well-being economy that we just heard so much about from the Club of Rome. This isn't new. This has been the Liberal Party since pure Romania. With the onslaught of economic, energy, and national unity problems of the mid-1970s, Trudeau did not discard his environmental concerns, but continued to articulate this holistic environmental vision. Communist, 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 communist. On the other hand, the Trudeau government's environmental policies and actions did not match his rhetoric. In the 1970s were fraught with persistent problems. Following Trudeau's near-electoral loss in 1972, he changed his staff and strategy, purging his inner circle of systems thinkers. In other words, he almost lost, so he got rid of some of the communists to kind of liberalize his party. He changed his staff and strategy, purging his inner circle of system thinkers, interdepartmental tensions underlain by ideological differences, the structure of Canada's federal system, and the long-term nature of environmental problems all contributed to Trudeau's inability to move from rhetoric to action on his transformative environmental vision. While much has changed since Trudeau's tenure, we are still struggling with many of the challenges he faced at the birth of Canadian environmental governance. Okay, so this sounds an awful lot like the Club of Rome thing, doesn't it? It's very similar to the Club of Rome thing. In fact, that's probably where the ideas came from. But what we're seeing is that Trudeau ran into political and other problems, could not implement his vision, and it all had to kind of get backburnered. Just like with the Club of Rome, when its predictions kept failing. So, early environmental aspirations in Canadian politics, 1968 to 1972. I'm not going to read through this whole thing. It's not all that long, but I'm not going to drag all the way through it. But I want to get really clear in all of your minds that his relationship with the Club of Rome was not superficial. Before the 1970s, Canadian environmental governance existed as separate domains that would only be brought together under Trudeau. See that? So he unified the environmental governance program. Canadian environmental governance is rooted in some of the earliest and most influential relationships linking Canada with the world through fish, fur, and timber, but attention to the environment was implicit. Canada was largely treated as a storehouse for natural resources to be exploited. During the 1990s, the environment was given explicit attention through forest conservation and national parks. Through the 1900s. The environment was given explicit attention through forest conservation and national parks, as well as energy development, pipelines, and oil spills. Regulations were developed to manage natural resources efficiently and protect them from over-exploitation. Now, obviously, nobody's against the idea of over-exploitation, but we also know that they do these federal land grabs, both in the United States and Canada, in order to control people's ability to be productive. When it says stuff like that Canada was largely treated as a storehouse for natural resources to be exploited, let me just tell you where prosperity comes from in most places and in most countries. It doesn't come from people working at Starbucks, although that's an important facet of the service economy. It comes from exploiting your natural resources. You can take a dirt poor country and discover something like lithium or cobalt in it, and all of a sudden it's not a dirt poor country. See Australia. It's amazing what can happen. You could take a dirt poor area of shithole desert and discover that it has huge oil fields under it, and it becomes one of the richest places on earth, like the Middle East. This is actually how you do it, but that's not what they wanted, because Trudeau's Canadian environmental governance was rooted in some of the earliest and most influential relationships, and his goal was to do the opposite. Now, I forgot to say something in a previous paragraph before this, which was, things didn't work out for Trudeau, and so they weren't able to implement his vision. But what is this Club of Rome document about? It's about changing the values of everyday people, in particular in this case, everyday Canadians, to get on board with this, so that the political conditions around the Liberal Party government will be able, or NDP even worse, will be able to implement this bullshit on behalf of the World Economic Forum, United Nations, and ultimately CCP, which at least the CCP knows is designed, I think the others do too, is designed to actually destroy Canada so that it doesn't have the capacity to have a high enough standard of living and a sense of freedom so that its people can stand on their own 2 feet against tyrants. It's in fact to drag them into a tyranny that they can't escape. Okay, so back to this. The environmental movement emerged full force in the 1950s and 1960s as people began to notice the impacts of humans on the environment. And Lost in the Barrens and Never Cry Wolf, Farley Mowat captured Canadians' imaginations, drawing attention to environmental issues, including human arrogance toward Indigenous peoples and wildlife. So notice that they used art and culture to influence a generation of hippies. The Canadian environmental movement was also influenced by the environmental revolution in the United States. Landmark books, again, culture to influence, such as Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, criticized rampant post-World War II industrialization and the destructive ecological impacts of uncontrolled scientific and technological development, most notably DDT and nuclear fallout. Prominent economists and politicians also began to question the environmental merits of industrial society and its pursuit of unbridled economic growth. In The Affluent Society, Canadian-born economist G.K. Galbraith criticized economic GDP growth as a poor measure of society's well-being. So there's your well-being economy stuff. Thanks, Canada. A Canadian-born economist came up with this idea that economic growth is a poor measure of well-being, and now we have all this shit about a well-being economy that's being foisted on us. In 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson eschewed the pursuit of growth. Johnson, the same one who did the Great Society and basically devastated all of our racial minorities and created the circumstances that we see today in inner cities. That Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson eschewed the pursuit of growth because it measured quantity but not quality, meaning, or beauty. In 1968, U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy echoed this sentiment, quote, "Gross national product does not allow for the health of our children." Actually, yes, it does, because gross national product reflects how much energy you are producing, and energy allows you to solve problems, including the health of your children. So gross national product does actually allow for the health of your children, because a rich society can afford to keep its children more healthy. But let's read Kennedy's words here. Gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does all of those. What the fuck are you talking about? It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. I'd love to know where he thinks poets and...
Bueno, vamos a detenernos en este momento, ¿ya? Ese señor Lindsay, a mí, yo algo que he dicho acá en mi podcast es que quiero traducir a todo James Lindsay, o sea, yo quiero, o sea, ser el traductor oficial de James Lindsay al español, sí, porque yo no he escuchado a la primera persona aquí en mi país, por lo menos, y en otros que hablan español, que estén hablando de Lindsay. Muy importante lo que está diciendo ese señor ahí, muy importante. Nos habla el Club de Roma, del Foro Económico Mundial, del gobierno Trudeau, ¿sí? De los hippies canadienses en los 60s y con su tema ecológico y etcétera. O sea, algo que yo he dicho acá en el podcast es que no sabemos bien qué es el Canadá. O sea, uno tiene un familiar ahí que migró allá y uno se imagina que eso ya, esos son paraísos y arcoíris, y allá lo que es un gobierno como el que persiguió a Jordan Peterson por el asunto de la ley C-16 y todo eso, pues nosotros de verdad somos muy ignorantes, de verdad, y esa ignorancia de verdad es por no saber inglés, es por no saber idiomas, por no querer decir nada más en otros idiomas, sino groserías, y todos sabemos decir son of a bitch, ¿ok? Todo el mundo sabe decir eso, pero nadie se interesa más allá de qué serán esas sociedades, ir a hablar con esa gente que estará pasando ya, no nos interesa, ¿no? Tiene sin cuidado, ¿ya? Uno de los comentarios del señor Lindsay ahí es que todo lo que diga transformación, ok, todo lo que diga transformation, ok, es sospechoso, muy sospechoso, es lo que habíamos hablado de Kafka, ok, y las editoriales haciéndole venias a la corrección política de esta época, traduciendo el cuento de Kafka por la transformación en vez de la metamorfosis, porque es que hoy en día las editoriales están diciendo la transformación. Uy, vaya, bueno, este es el avance de nuestro vestido, ¿ya? Es lo que hemos hecho en 50 minutos. Bueno, vamos a detenernos. Muchas gracias. Vielen Dank.